Be quick about it, man. This leg pains me.
Hey guys, tonight let's go back several centuries, to a time when people jousted on horseback and believed that illnesses were caused by demons. But the king we're going to talk about is famous for something completely different. Henry VIII and his notorious leg. Sounds strange, right? Who would make a video about a king's leg? But trust me, Henry VIII's leg was anything but ordinary. It was a historical character in its own right, one that could turn a charming, elegant king into a walking nightmare, an expert at beheading anyone who displeased him. And it all started with one accident, one fall from a horse. Did chronic pain truly turn him into a completely different person? And more importantly, could that very same aching leg have helped reshape the entire history of England? So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And don't forget to leave a comment letting me know where you are and what time it is there. That helps me know that this story is reaching amazing people from all over the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Before delving into the harrowing story of King Henry VIII's suffering, let us briefly review his biography, lineage, and the achievements and flaws that made him famous in history. Henry VIII was born on June 28, 1591, at Greenwich Palace. He was the second son of King Henry VII, the founder of the Tudor dynasty and Queen Elizabeth of York. His paternal grandfather, King Edward IV, had secured the throne during the Wars of the Roses, while his mother, Elizabeth of York, was Edward's only surviving daughter, whose marriage to Henry VII united the rival houses of Lancaster and York. Although Henry was not the direct heir at birth, his elder brother Arthur held the title Prince of Wales when Arthur died in 1502 at the age of 15. The 11-year-old Henry suddenly became heir apparent and was formally invested as Prince of Wales. On April 21st, 1509, just weeks after his father's death, 17-year-old Henry ascended the throne at Westminster Abbey. His reign lasted 38 years, until January 28, 1547. During that time, Henry VIII implemented several major policies. He built a powerful navy by commissioning new warships, laying the foundations for England's future maritime empire, expanded trade and economic ties with Flanders, Italy, and Spain, and consolidated royal authority by reforming land administration and taxation to curb the power of the nobility. His most notable act was the Act of Supremacy in 1534, in which he broke with the Roman Catholic Church, established the Church of England, and declared himself supreme head over both ecclesiastical and civil law. In his personal life, Henry VIII contracted 6 marriages: to Catherine of Aragon, Anne Boleyn, Jane Seymour, Anne of Cleves, Catherine Howard, and Catherine Parr. He is infamous for ordering the executions of 2 wives, Anne Boleyn in 1536 and Catherine Howard in 1542, annulling 2 others, and outliving one. Jane Seymour died in childbirth, before spending his final years with Catherine Parr. His relentless quest for a male heir and his political ambitions left deep wounds on both himself and the realm. Physically, Henry VIII epitomized Tudor strength and charisma. He stood approximately 6 feet tall, 1.83 meters, weighed about 210 pounds, 96 kilograms, and had a 32-inch waist, 81 centimeters. He adored jousting, horsemanship, and archery, and was even praised by Justiniana Wynne, the Venetian ambassador's wife, as the monarch with the most splendid calves. The image of Henry in shining armor, charging across the tournament field, became a symbol of Tudor pride. Yet this gallant king had glaring weaknesses. His temperament grew increasingly volatile, quick to anger, and merciless toward perceived traitors. Over the course of his reign, he ordered the execution of more than 57,000 people, including loyal nobles such as Sir Thomas More and Thomas Cromwell, and even former friends. His dissolution of the monasteries, 1536, 1541, bolstered royal finances but sparked rebellions, most notably the Pilgrimage of Grace of 1536, which were brutally suppressed. His extravagant lifestyle and profligate spending further alienated him from his subjects. However, the greatest turning point in Henry VIII's life stemmed from what seemed a minor accident. In the summer of 1536, after nearly 27 years on the throne, he took part in a joust at the Westminster Fair to assert his prowess. Facing Sir Henry Norris, Henry donned armour weighing several dozen pounds and charged at his opponent. In a split second of imbalance, he was unhorsed, and the several hundred-kilogram mount fell upon him, rendering him unconscious and fracturing multiple bones in his legs. The mishap occurred before Anne Boleyn, then pregnant with the future prince, and the shock caused her to miscarry immediately. The year 1536 came to be known as Henry's Annus Horribilis, his horrible year, because that accident inaugurated nearly 2 decades of excruciating physical and psychological torment. Wounds that seemed to heal became festering ulcers that oozed foul fluid, inflicting relentless agony. Where once he thrived in tournaments, he was reduced to a pale, listless monarch who needed attendants to support him. His formerly gracious demeanour hardened into brusqueness, violence, and cruelty toward courtiers and kin alike, as his kingdom shared in the tragedy of a ruler whose authority was inseparable from unceasing bodily suffering. Before the accident, Henry had been admired throughout the realm as the very embodiment of Tudor vitality and strength, a living testament to the promise and glory of his dynasty. His broad shoulders, sculpted arms, and lithe gait spoke of a monarch in the full bloom of youthful vigour. Each tournament field, each royal procession, seemed to bear witness to his robust health and effortless grace. Courtiers whispered among themselves that his presence alone lifted their spirits, and ambassadors wrote of his bearing with a mix of awe and envy. Yet, in the hazy summer of 1536, a single misstep on the tilt-yard altered the course of his life irrevocably. From that moment onward, Henry was no longer the untroubled young king who rode forth at dawn in polished armour. Instead, he became a figure of muted suffering, his once swift strides replaced by hesitant, faltering steps. Attendants were ever at his side, proffering an elbow here, a steadying hand there, guiding him through stone corridors that echoed with the sounds of courtly ceremony he could scarcely bear to endure. The lively clang of trumpets and the cheerful chatter of nobles felt distant and sharp in his aching ears. Although the royal physicians had rushed to his aid, employing every available remedy of their age, from herbal poultices of lavender and comfrey to steaming baths of rosewater and vinegar, Henry never reclaimed the agility of his youth. What first appeared as a series of bruises and swelling soon gave way to deep-seated ulcers along both legs, festering wounds that resisted every attempted cure. They would bandage him in the morning, only for the dressings to emerge stained with tainted fluid by nightfall, the hollow scent of decay drifting through his private chamber until even the walls seemed to weep with his torment. With movement so precarious, public appearances became rare events. The king, once renowned for his prowess on the tilt-yard and in the hunting forest, found himself confined to a specially constructed throne, with cushions designed to ease the pressure on his wounded limbs. Court pageants continued, but his presence was often signalled only by a curt nod from behind crimson velvet drapery, a pale shadow of the monarch who had once charged into every festival with blazing eyes and a ready laugh. His temperament, too, suffered under the weight of unrelenting pain. Where he had once been generous and spirited, even to a fault, he now grew quick to fury and harsh in judgment. Courtiers who ventured into light-hearted banter quickly discovered the peril of a jest misplaced, for Henry's resignation to suffering had hardened into a swift and merciless justice. Servants who failed to anticipate his needs were chastised sharply. Noblemen whose counsel displeased him found themselves at the mercy of his wrath. Even those dearest to him family members whose loyalty had never wavered felt the sting of his impatience when they attempted to soothe his anguish with gentle words or well-meaning advice. In the quieter hours, when the bustle of the palace receded and candlelight danced upon the cold stone floor, Henry turned to the comforts of a more indulgent kind. No longer could he engage in the vigorous sports of his youth, but he could partake in the festal feasts that lined his later years. His daily fare came to rival that of the grandest banquets. Rich meats drenched in spiced sauces, cheeses aged until crumbly and pungent, thick loaves of bread slathered with butter churned fresh each morning, and always copious flagons of wine and cups of potent ale, their warmth offering a momentary reprieve from the ceaseless ache below his knees. Such excess, however, carried its own price. Henry's girth expanded, his waist swelling beyond the fine tailoring of earlier courtly attire, his once trim silhouette replaced by the rounded form of a man grown too weary to move. Sleep, too, became a fickle ally. He tossed on plush mattresses, attended by chamberlains who tried every tincture of lavender oil and soporific draught, yet found only uneasy slumber, broken by dreams of relentless pain. Waking often brought sharper anguish than the hours before, as his legs throbbed in protest, each heartbeat echoing the memory of that fateful joust. Thus began the long chapter of sorrow that would stretch for nearly 20 years, a period in which Henry VIII's legend intertwined with the very wounds that would never heal. His earlier brilliance, reflected in the polished steel of his armour and the proud tilt of his plume, gave way to a more sombre glory, one marked by endurance and the quiet dignity of a sovereign forced to acknowledge the frailty of his own flesh. In the hush of candlelit galleries, where tapestries recorded the triumphs of the Tudor line, his image came to stand as both monarch and martyr, a ruler who bore his crown upon shoulders weakened by suffering, yet steadfast in duty until the final breath. Directly after that harrowing fall, Henry VIII was carried into the royal treatment chamber, where court physicians hoped to mend injuries that seemed beyond repair. In the sleepy demands of a 16th century infirmary, there were no miraculous anesthetics, nor any concept of antibiotics. Only crude hemostatic methods, poultices of crushed leaves, linen swathes, and decoctions of various herbs. At first, the royal surgeons proceeded with cat-like care, removing his cumbersome breastplate and gauntlets, splinting fractured bones, and bidding the king to rest without movement. Yet, in a hopeful misjudgment, they allowed him to rise too early, an error that thwarted the careful alignment of bone and permitted stagnant blood to pool beneath the skin, slowly breeding an ulcer that would haunt his every waking hour. Within half a year of that fateful accident, those initial scars transformed into festering sores along both legs. Blackish fluid reminiscent of putrid rodent pus seeped from cracked flesh, giving off a rank stench that clung to the tapestries and lingered in every turret of Greenwich Palace. The physicians changed his bandages by candlelight, rinsing wounds in saline brine and layering mixtures of powdered pearl, brimstone and spirituous tinctures. Desperate for relief, they once heated a wrought iron branding iron until it glowed searing red, pressing it to the ulcer's throat in a grisly attempt at purification. This act of cauterization brought agony deeper than any he had known, yet the wound only encroached further along quivering skin. In that era, without antiseptics or germ theory, the body's own fragile repair mechanisms were all that stood between the king and a much swifter demise. But the calamity extended beyond mere physical torment. It became a spectre haunting the king's mind. The odour of decay drifted through 3 grand chambers before a single soul would murmur of the wound's existence. Henry drew inward, cloaked in shame and suspicion, fearing that any mention of his malady was a dagger aimed at his sovereignty. Courtiers, once eager to share jest and counsel, fell silent lest a casual remark about pestilent sores be construed as treasonous or disrespectful, punishable by swift execution. In those dim corridors, where once laughter had rung out, hushed footsteps replaced merriment, and even the low murmur of prayer seemed a dangerous indulgence. Henry, once celebrated for his munificence toward the poor, began to rule with an iron fist, gleefully ordering the execution of ministers and nobles alike for the slightest hint of criticism. The unrelenting ache carved deeper crevices in his spirit. Sleep abandoned him completely. In the small hours he would sit by the chamber window, staring through leaded panes at a world that had grown distant and cold. Impatience gnawed at him, leaving his restive attendants to bear the brunt of his mercurial temper. In these wakeful nights, he sought solace in small comforts: cups of potent wine, sweetmeats heavy with spices, morsels of candied fruits he once would have dismissed. Yet the fleeting warmth of such indulgences only underscored the ceaseless throbbing in his legs, a reminder that the original wound, barely more than a hair's breadth of broken bone, had metamorphosed into a cruel imprisoner. Unable to walk the galleries as he once had, Henry directed that a wheeled chair be fashioned in the royal workshops, padded with velvet and draped in crimson cloth. There, attended by silent pages, he would be pushed from chamber to council chamber, the grinding of wooden wheels marking his solemn progress. Each turn of the axle brought a fresh agony as bruised flesh rubbed against upholstery, and he clenched his teeth against the strain. In this silent theatre, the sovereign became a spectre of power and pain combined, his crown gleaming above hollowed cheeks, his legs bound and throbbed but still carrying him toward the throne. Thus, a single horse's fall and a moment's imbalance transformed Henry VIII into a man unrecognizable from his former self. No longer the gallant monarch whose laughter rang across the tilt-yard, he became a figure of stern severity, suspicion etched into every frown, and an unspoken oath that any who approached too closely to his suffering would feel the full force of his royal wrath. In those candlelit rooms, where the hush of midnight reigned supreme, the king shaped his legacy anew, one defined as much by the anguished cries of his body as by the decrees that bore his name. Following his grievous fall, Henry's medical ordeal soon intertwined with the most personal of his affairs, his marriages, and reshaped the politics of his realm. Before that cruel summer of 1536, he had already grown weary of his union with Catherine of Aragon, whose inability to bear him a male heir fueled the controversy known as the King's Great Matter. As he pressed Rome for an annulment, Henry seized upon the opportunity to assert supremacy over the English Church, founding the Church of England and installing Thomas Cranmer as Archbishop of Canterbury, who in turn declared his marriage to Catherine null and void. With Catherine's fate sealed, Anne Boleyn ascended as queen, bearing Henry a daughter, Elizabeth, and carrying another child one hoped to be a prince when tragedy struck on that fateful tilt-yard. Witnessing the once vigorous monarch lying helpless upon his bed, Anne was overcome with terror. In her anguish, she suffered a sudden miscarriage. Rumours rippled through the court that she had brought misfortune upon the king, and whispers that her presence had cursed Henry's recovery further darkened the mood in Whitehall. Within half a year of the accident, emboldened by suspicion and fear born of his ever-present agony, Henry levelled charges of treason, adultery, and even incest against Anne and her brother George. These fabrications, intended to sever ties with a former love, led to Anne's execution in May of 1536, scarcely 3 years after her coronation, her head falling upon the scaffold amid muffled sobs, and a court drained of colour. Even as the echo of that final blow faded, Henry renewed his quest for stability and a male heir. The very next day, he became betrothed to Jane Seymour, a gentlewoman whose quiet demeanour offered a soothing contrast to the turmoil of the preceding months. 10 days late, they were wed, and Jane gave him the long-awaited son, Edward. Yet the joy proved fleeting. Jane perished in childbirth, her life ebbing away amid the same crimson sheets that should have heralded new hope. As Henry beheld her lifeless form, his heart, already battered by unceasing pain in his legs, felt the weight of each funeral he would attend in the years ahead. Each ceremony, Catherine's, Anne's, Jane's, carried its toll on his spirit, even as his body continued to writhe in the relentless torture of ulcerated flesh. Henry's manner of managing royal relationships grew ever more ruthless, an echo of the cruelty that seeped into his bones along with the blackened discharge from his wounds. He replaced wives, not solely for dynastic reasons, but was driven by an unsettled mind, quick to anger whenever a new spouse failed to produce a prince. Courtiers, once free to speak frankly, hushed their words, wary of a king for whom suspicion was second nature. Councillors dared not mention any matter that might disturb his fragile composure, and ministers walked distant corridors, avoiding his direct gaze, lest they find themselves entangled in yet another purge. Among the common folk, tales abounded of the mighty king's hidden fragility, that beneath his ostentatious robes and ornate crown lay a man haunted by the certainty that his own body would betray him. They whispered that each step he took was a gamble, whether he might collapse into darkness or summon the strength to rule another day. They believed that his chronic fear of death by lingering disease had hardened him into a sovereign for whom mercy was a forgotten luxury. Thus one sees how the medical catastrophe of Henry's 27th regnal year radiated outward, touching every facet of his reign. His divorce from Catherine of Aragon, the rise and fall of Anne Boleyn, the brief promise of Jane Seymour's son, each episode bore the imprint of his physical suffering, and each fueled a succession of political tremors that reshaped the kingdom. In the hushed antechambers and tapestry-lined galleries of his palaces, the once gallant king became a figure of brooding intensity, a ruler whose authority was enforced as much by the anguish in his flesh as by the edicts he pronounced. Even the grandeur of his court, with its gilded finery and resplendent ceremonies, could not mask the undercurrent of dread that pulsed through every council meeting and every royal banquet. For Henry VIII had become, in body and in mind, a man uneasy with his own mortality, and resolute to wield the full power of the crown in defiance of the relentless ache that dwelled in his veins. Following that fateful collision in 1536, which served only as the opening act to a lifetime of bodily calamity for Henry VIII, the king's physical decline deepened into a slow, unyielding tragedy. As the ulcers along his legs spread and deepened, he found himself unable to walk without agonizing effort. The once active monarch, famous for his skill on the tilt-yard and in the hunting forests, now spent his days confined to a specially crafted wheeled chair, its wheels creaking softly as pages and servants pushed him from chamber to chamber. To numb the ceaseless ache that gnawed at his bones, Henry turned to the only comforts within his reach: food and drink. Under the so-called Ordinances of Eltham, he decreed that his daily provisions must include no less than 20 gallons of ale and wine, alongside an unending parade of noble fowl, pheasant, quail, and even the occasional swan, interspersed with mountains of buttered eggs, cheeses rich and pungent, and confections sweet enough to tempt any weary palate. Courtiers whispered half in jest that he consumed the equivalent of an entire restaurant menu each day, as though he aimed to quell his misery through sheer volume of indulgence. That relentless embrace of gluttony, paired with a wholly sedentary life, caused Henry's bulk to expand beyond all recognition. By 1546, he weighed in excess of 300 pounds, that is, nearly 136 kilograms, and his waist had stretched to a staggering 52 inches, or roughly 132 centimeters. To rise from his throne required the labor of a hoisting mechanism crafted from sturdy timbers, a wooden crane that lifted him onto his horse, with the solemnity of a funeral pallbearer carrying a coffin. Commoners, seeing this contraption, likened it to the very gibbet of sacrificial rites, as though the once mighty king were being carried to his own immolation. In correspondence to the Duke of Norfolk, Henry confided in his characteristic, weary hand: "My body is beset by a vexing illness of the legs, and the physicians counsel me not to venture far in the heat of the Sunday." Yet, in the long hours of enforced stillness, he found temptation in the cellar and the buttery. Goblets of spiced wine, flagons of barley ale, each offered a fleeting warmth against the chill of loneliness and pain. His banquets became events of almost ritualistic excess, where every roasted bird and every sugared tart served as a momentary salve to a spirit fraying at the edges. Even as he consumed all these riches, the spectre of serious afflictions loomed, though no one in the 16th century spoke of diabetes or hypertension. The signs were clear in retrospect: excessive thirst after each cup, laboured breathing following a bite of meat, pulses that throbbed like distant drums. Yet the notion of a chronic illness requiring dietary restraint was beyond their ken. Instead, the king pressed on, equating the abundance of his table with the breadth of his power. To eat, to drink, to feast was to affirm his sovereignty, even as his legs, swollen and pitted with sores, protested every attempt at movement. In quieter moments, when the torches dimmed and the chatter of the hall faded into a hush, Henry would recline on cushioned divans, his breath heavy with the odour of roasted meats. He half closed his eyes, listening to the soft scurry of mice behind the wainscoting, the drip of some distant cistern, and the endless whisper of the stones cooling overnight. The world beyond his chamber seemed to exist in a different realm: fields where huntsmen tracked deer beneath the dawn mist, tilt-yard where challengers tested their mettle, and council rooms where he once strode with unbroken confidence. But those memories belonged to another lifetime. Now, he knew the truth that would echo through the ages. However vast his realm, however absolute his decrees, the flesh remained a merciless adversary if left to fester and weaken. His ulcers never healed. They exhaled that same rank, animal scent that marked the beginning of his suffering. Each dressing change brought fresh tears to his eyes, and a deeper dread of the night to come. As the king's weight grew, courtiers found themselves anxious to meet his gaze without showing pity or alarm. They adapted to his new formality, addressing him as "Your Majesty," while sidelining any mention of processions or tournaments. The brilliant tapestries of past glories, the victories on French soil, the diplomatic triumphs in negotiating treaties hung untouched in the hallways, spectators to his private decline. At the table, the pewter plates glinted with roasted birds and sugar-glazed fruits, an ostentatious display that served as both tribute and distraction. Yet, with every delectable morsel, Henry traded a piece of his vitality. His heart laboured under the burden of a body swollen by excess. His breath came in shallow intervals, as though each gulp of pudding pressed upon his lungs. The companionship of wine, once a welcome distraction, began to make him drowsy, and he welcomed the drowsiness with a weary sigh. Better to drift into a torpor than to remain fully conscious of throbbing nerves and aching joints. In the soft gloom of his private chambers, shadows lengthened like dark reminders of his mortality. There, in the hush, he would murmur to himself, half asleep, that no matter how many banquet tables he filled, the ulcers in his flesh would remain hungry, ever craving the small mercy of release. And in that longing, the most powerful monarch in Europe came to understand an austere truth, that even the greatest earthly power could not bend the body to its will, and that a reign founded on flesh and blood would always be subject to the frailty of flesh and blood. Thus, with each heavy spoonful of custard and every golden sip of mead, Henry VIII wove the final threads of his tragic tapestry, one of regal excess and bodily ruin, a caution whispered across the centuries. No matter the heights of dominion, the body, if abandoned to its wounds, remains the most unforgiving of masters. Alongside his festering leg ulcers and a diet of unrelenting excess, Henry VIII further undermined his own health through perilous fashion choices. In the vigour of his youth, he delighted in displaying his sculpted calves, an embodiment of Tudor ideals of masculine beauty, by fastening tightly cinched garters just below the knee. These decorative straps, made of fine silk and embroidered with gold thread, accentuated his lithe limbs and completed the courtly silhouette. Yet, in the eyes of modern physicians, such constriction of flesh can stifle circulation, invite the formation of blood clots, exacerbate varicose veins, and delay the healing of any existing wounds. Even after his fall, the one that should have cautioned him against further strain, Henry persisted in this habit. Night after night, the narrow bands bit into his swollen flesh, turning each movement into a renegade pain. As his legs swelled, oozed, and grew increasingly inflamed, rumours began to circulate among both court and commoners that perhaps the king suffered from a chronic malady of a more scandalous nature, late-stage syphilis. His well-known appetites, both at table and in the company of women, fueled these whispers. Yet, most modern historians dismiss the notion. There is no record of Henry receiving mercury treatments, the only known cure for syphilis in his day, and no evidence that he spent lengthy periods in seclusion as one afflicted with that disease might. Nor did Catherine of Aragon, or his later children, exhibit symptoms consistent with congenital transmission. Instead, the king's ulcers clearly traced their origin to the fractured leg bones of 1536, compounded by underlying conditions, what we would now call diabetes or hypertension, and by his unyielding practice of binding his limbs too tightly. In a fervent but ultimately futile bid for relief, Tudor physicians turned to barbaric procedures. With no anaesthetic to ease his torment, they heated razor-sharp blades and iron rods in the fire until they glowed white-hot, then pressed them to the weeping sores in a practice called cauterization. Each session of burning drove King Henry to the edge of consciousness, tears streaming down his cheeks as muscle and tendon seared beneath the scorching metal. The agony was so profound that he would lean against panelled walls, grasping at the cold wood to steady himself, lest he cry out loud enough to alert the entire household. For lack of a better alternative, when cautery offered no substantive cure, he placed his hopes in herbal salves, poultices of mallow, comfrey, and marshmallow root, applied by quivering hands. Yet with every fresh dressing, the odour of gangrene rose again, an acrid spectre that drifted through the palace corridors and clung to tapestries as though seeking an audience. The transformation of Henry's court was stark and unsettling. Where once the clang of trumpets and the polite murmur of nobles had filled the great hall, a stifling silence now reigned, punctuated only by the soft pad of servants' slippers and the distant drip of some unseen faucet. The tapestries that told tales of his military triumphs seemed to recoil from the potent stench wafting through the air. Yet the king forbade any whisper of his illness to escape the inner sanctum of Whitehall, for he believed that a sovereign who revealed weakness risked losing the absolute authority he had so boldly claimed when he broke with Rome. Thus, even as his flesh decayed under jewelled sleeves, his public image remained untarnished by talk of rot. This fear of vulnerability, coupled with unrelenting pain, steeled Henry's heart into something darker than mere royal severity. He became a monarch who would not tolerate dissent, even the gentlest jibe about that dreadful sore, or a jest regarding the king's imminent demise, could result in sudden disappearance from court. Accusations of treason, or simply of disrespect, rained down upon those who dared to speak of his condition. Before long, courtiers learned better than to bring wine or sweetmeats to Henry's table without permission, for such tokens of sympathy might be construed as reminders of his infirmity, and thus acts of disloyalty. The elaborate feasts, once showcases of Tudor abundance, turned into grim arenas in which each dish placed before him was a gauntlet thrown at fate itself. His appetite, unbroken by illness, became a tool of power. With each heaping plate and bottomless cup, he demonstrated that neither disease nor dissent could undermine his rule. In pursuing these extremes of fashion, medicine, and appetite, Henry VIII fashioned a personal myth of indomitable will, but at a monstrous price. His subjects watched with a mixture of awe and horror as their sovereign, once the picture of virile splendor, succumbed to a reign of creeping decay. The very crown that had once gleamed so brightly upon his brow now rested upon a head weighed down by unutterable suffering. And yet, beyond the gilded thresholds and ostentatious grandeur, Henry's legacy would endure as a cautionary tale, whispered among generations, that no matter how exalted one's station, the soft tissues of the body remain subject to forces beyond any sovereign's command, and that the most dangerous indulgences are those that promise comfort while hastening the body's inexorable decline. In the decade following that calamitous accident of 1536, King Henry's legs not only deteriorated further but also became an ever-present, unspoken terror within his own court. In 1538, he enacted the so-called Ordinances of Eltham, a sweeping set of regulations designed to codify every aspect of royal service. These rules stipulated that his daily provisions must include at least 20 gallons of ale and wine, along with an unending array of noble game, pheasant, quail, and swan, accompanied by mountains of buttered eggs and rich cheeses. No detail was too trivial. Pages were instructed on precisely how to present each plate, and servants were warned to wheel his chair with the utmost caution. For Henry's once supple limbs could no longer support him, and so he spent his days perched upon a crimson velvet wheeled chair, drawn gently through the echoing corridors of Whitehall. The stench of his festering sores drifted through every great hall, weaving itself into the very fabric of courtly life. Courtiers, fearful of even the slightest misstep, dared not mention his ailing limbs aloud. Their tongues clove to the roofs of their mouths whenever talk veered near mortality or infirmity, for to speak of his pain was to invite ruin. Instead, they bowed in silence, voices muted as though the king's suffering were a profane secret. The grand tapestries depicting Henry's martial triumphs hung neglected, their vibrant threads dulled by the heavy swirl of foul odour, an invisible miasma that clung to velvet curtains and chased lingering echoes from vaulted ceilings. This period also marked the deepening of Henry's resolve to appear invulnerable, especially after he had severed ties with Rome to establish the Church of England. Though the break granted him unrivaled spiritual sovereignty, it also stirred fears of rebellion among staunch Catholic factions. Whispered rumours of his mortal affliction and speculation that the king will not last the year reached his ears, despite the court's best efforts at concealment. Any insinuation that his reign might end in weakness or death was met with swift, merciless reprisal. Thus, he issued harsh new edicts, enforced with grim finality, to preserve the image of an indomitable monarch. Among the most notorious of these purges was the so-called Exeter conspiracy of 1538 to 1539. The Duke of Exeter, Henry Courtenay, and Lord Montague, Henry Pole, both men of high birth and close ties to the Plantagenet line, were accused of treason, allegedly plotting to depose the king in favour of Courtenay. Though their true crime lay in their lingering loyalty to the papacy and their unease at England's schism from Rome, Henry used a surreptitiously recorded conversation as damning evidence. According to the so-called proof, they had been overheard jesting that His Majesty's ulcerated legs rendered him soon to meet his Maker, and that England would be a merry land once he had fallen. Whether these words were ever uttered is uncertain, for many historians believe the conspiracy served merely as a pretext for eliminating prominent critics. At Westminster, a swift trial found them guilty, and both heads fell upon the scaffold, their blood staining the very steps upon which they once stood in honour. The king's wrath was not reserved for mere peers. Any courtier, be they a high councillor or a humble clerk who slipped a tongue regarding the monarch's sores or whispered too freely about mortality, faced a similarly grim fate. The slightest jest, the faintest allusion to his ailing frame, invited accusations of contempt or treason. Those who remembered Henry's earlier generosity toward the poor, or who recalled his once jovial laughter, found themselves silenced by the fear of the block. And as the rumour mill ground out fresh allegations, Henry's mind grew ever more besieged by suspicion. He saw conspiracy behind each shadowed doorway, betrayal in every courtly smile. In these years, the king's very personality seemed to shift as irrevocably as the seasons. The warmth and affability that had once endeared him to nobles and commoners alike cooled into a frosty severity. His council meetings, once lively gatherings of discussion, became stifling affairs where men dared not meet his gaze too long. Any critique, no matter how constructive, was read as a veiled threat. Yet, in the hush of midnight, Henry must have felt the iron laws of aging and illness tighten around him. Each eviction of a supposed traitor, while cementing his grip on power, did little to still the throbbing in his legs or to hush the echoes of his own mortality. And so, within the grand tapestry of Tudor rule, the final threads darkened. The banner of a once youthful king, galloping fearless on the jousting field, gave way to the sombre silhouette of a sovereign encased in courtly dread. His power, absolute in theory, was in practice inseparable from the body that ached with every passing day. Through banquets laced with excess and edicts enforced by fear, Henry VIII strove to prove himself invincible. Yet, as night fell upon his chambers and candles guttered in the gloom, he could not escape the truth that the most formidable fortress of all his own flesh had become his greatest, most relentless adversary. Before resorting to the fiery terror of cauterization, Tudor physicians had first tested a host of gentler razor-seeing, yet equally ineffectual treatments upon King Henry's festering sores. In the amber glow of the apothecary's lamp, they ground pearls into a chalky paste, stirred brimstone into salves, and infused spirits with exotic herbs imported via camel caravans from the lands of Central Asia and the Levant. Recipes written in shaky Latin and Old English prescribe mixtures of rose petals, marshmallow root, and comfrey, all intended to draw out infection and soothe inflamed flesh. On some nights, court surgeons would cleanse his wounds with diluted sea salt believed to possess the power to kill pestilent humours. Yet in the damp, unsterile chambers of Whitehall, this simple rinse only prolonged the agony, washing fresh irritants into the tissue and leaving the king to endure the slow burn of healing that never came. When these time-honoured remedies proved inadequate, the practitioners turned to their most feared instrument, a wrought-iron branding iron, heated in a brazier until it glowed like molten copper. Without anaesthetic to soften the blow, the heated plate was pressed to each ulcer in a gruesome ritual of purification. In that moment of contact, Henry VIII would convulse, sweat beading along his brow, as muscle and sinew sizzled beneath the searing metal. He bit his lip until it bled, striving to muffle any cry that might betray his vulnerability. Yet no amount of cautery could staunch the flow of black, fetid fluid. Indeed, the wounds often widened afterward, the scalded flesh giving way beneath the layers of protective burn, leaving him to endure fresh pain where once lay hope of relief. Amid these trials, a rumour took root, one that whispered of late-stage syphilis, a disease that matched the outward signs of ulceration and the king's well-documented extravagance in matters of the flesh. Henry's notorious roster of 6 wives and his penchant for amorous liaisons provided ample fodder for gossip and foreign ambassadors alike. Yet the claim found little solid ground in the chronicles of the day. There exists no record of his receiving the renowned mercury treatments, the only remedy for syphilis in that age, and no evidence that he absented himself from court for extended convalescence. Moreover, none of his children, including his cherished son Edward, bore any telltale signs of congenital transmission. Instead, the consensus among modern scholars is that the ulcers coursing through his legs originated directly from the fractures sustained in that ill-fated joust, compounded by factors we now call metabolic syndrome, the weight of unrestrained feasting, the constriction of blood vessels by tight garters, and the strain of unmediated hypertension. Despite these repeated failures, Henry remained adamant that his condition stay hidden from public gaze. He issued strict orders that any mention of his health be recorded as stable in the royal dispatches, and he forbade his physicians from speaking of the full extent of his suffering. The courtiers, once eager to offer comfort, fell silent in fear, reluctant to appear cowardly by dallying on the topic, yet terrified that any misstep might invite a summons to the Tower. In this atmosphere of enforced reticence, the king's inner circle grew wary, mistrust shadowing every whispered counsel. Foreign experts, luminaries of the day, such as Paracelsus, who had travelled from Basel to London, hoping to share new methods, were denied the privilege of an audience. The fledgling experiments in Western medicine remained unrecognised within Whitehall's hallowed halls, deemed too radical for a sovereign whose rule was built upon tradition and perceived invincibility. Day by day, the king endured his private torment. The stench of his wounds would rise through the floorboards and taint the tapestries, compelling noble ladies to press delicate handkerchiefs to their nostrils while bowing before their liege. The fragrance of lavender sachets, once scattered along corridors to calm nerves, now competed with the rank odour of gangrene. Henry learned to swallow the bitterness of both his food and his fate, drawing inward like a wounded animal, preserving a mask of stoic authority for those rare formal occasions when he was compelled to appear. Yet the pain that racked his legs did not merely erode his flesh. It wounded his spirit and sharpened his ruthlessness. He discovered that if he could not mend his own body, he could wield the terror of his unspoken affliction as a weapon. Any who dared to suggest that the sovereign might be subject to mortal frailty or worse, that his reign could end in disgrace, found themselves abruptly removed from courtly favour. Quiet suspicions or gentle inquiries were answered with summary dismissals, confiscation of property, or worse. Indeed, the king's celebrated appetite, once a charming sign of indulgent majesty, seemed now to roar as a challenge to fate itself, to consume, to command, and to deny the body's decrepitude all the more fiercely. Thus, within the grand tapestry of Tudor pageantry, a darker thread was woven, a pattern of secrecy and fear that bound the court in whispered dread. As Henry's ulcers persisted, so too did his campaign to project unwavering might, all while his own flesh bore witness to a different story. In the hush of candlelit chambers, courtiers dared not speak of the truth, that their king, for all his splendour and sovereign decree, remained as mortal and vulnerable as any man. And in that quiet refrain, they learned a lesson that would echo long after his passing. That flesh and power, once intimately entwined, can become bitter enemies if the frailty of the body is denied and the dominion of the crown is enforced by the sting of hidden wounds. Not only did Henry VIII wage a losing battle against the ulcers that festered upon his legs, but he also found himself beset by an array of metabolic maladies, what we would now call diabetes, hypertension, and atherosclerosis. In the long, gentle haze of candlelight, his court physicians whispered concerns over letters and diary entries that recorded their anxieties in careful script. They noted how His Majesty doth consume enough meats and drink to sate the hungriest soul in all England, and how he ne'er refuseth a cup of ale or wine, be it morning or eve. Unbeknownst to them, such unbridled indulgence, estimated at roughly 5,000 calories per day, a figure 5 times higher than the intake recommended in our own modern times, set the stage for a kind of static obesity, a grand phrase to describe a king who sat enthroned, yet weighed down by his own excess. The physicians observed signs that we would now recognize as hallmarks of diabetes: the king's unquenchable thirst, the frequent visits to chamber pots, and his laboured breath whenever he attempted even the briefest stroll through his private apartments. Yet in an age before blood tests or sugar-specific remedies, none could confirm the true cause. Likewise, his flushed complexion and recurring headaches hinted at high blood pressure, though no instrument of measurement existed beyond their attentive gaze. These twin ailments, hyperglycemia and hypertension, combined to starve his peripheral circulation, delivering yet one more cruel blow to the feeble healing capacity of his leg wounds. At court, rumour blossomed like night-blooming flowers. Wags and courtiers wove jests about their sovereign. At dawn, he is stern as a judge. By noon, he laughs like a boon companion, they said, implying that his mood swung as wildly as his blood sugar. Another quip ran that, once he hunted deer across the fields, now he lies cushioned upon velvet, compelled only to feast. These whispered barbs, traded in hushed tones behind silken fans, deepened the king's private shame and his resolve to keep all whispers locked behind palace doors. Any who ventured to speak of his frailty risked being swept into the next purge. Despite the pleas of his most trusted healers, men and women who urged him to curb his appetite, to sip lightly, and to walk beneath the shade of elm trees, the monarch refused their counsel. To curb my feasting, he is said to have declared, would be to weaken my very spirit. He believed that his unassailable authority, the crown upon his head, was the only true safeguard of his life and legacy. Better to remain feared, he felt, than to be pitied. And so he spurned diet and dallied with a venomous comfort of plate and chalice, trusting might and majesty over humble restraint. Viewed through the lens of contemporary medicine, Henry VIII epitomizes the tragic interplay between chronic disease and diminished quality of life. His fettered legs, swollen with fluid and burdened by clots, mirrored the stagnation of a body enslaved by excess. His heart laboured beneath layers of fat and fevered flesh, and each heartbeat echoed a warning. That unchecked indulgence, when combined with the ravages of chronic wounds and high blood pressure, invites decline. Yet for Henry, pain itself became his sharpest tool of rule. He weaponized his suffering, each groan beneath the cautery iron, each laboured sigh as he settled into his wheeled chair, into a means of instilling dread among his subjects. In that manner, the king found in his own agony a perilous kind of strength. Every decree that banned mention of his ailments, every execution meted out to those unwise enough to pity or jest, solidified his image as an unassailable ruler. And though his body decayed from the inside out, the aura of invincibility that he projected through fear and feasting grew only more formidable. In the hush of candlelit corridors, courtiers learned to speak only of policy and praise, never of his mortal vulnerabilities, for they understood that no mortal plea or medicinal remedy could stand against the sovereign's command so fiercely as his own cultivated terror. Thus, Henry VIII's final chapter offers a somnolent warning that unchecked appetite and the denial of our own frailty can lead even the greatest among us into a prison of our own making, where pain is not only endured but wielded as a weapon, and where the crown weighs heaviest upon the dukedoms of the heart and the fragile kingdom of the flesh. During the years spanning 1540 to 1546, the slow decline of King Henry's health hastened into a rapid unravelling of physical capacity. By 1540, the ulcers that had begun as mere sores along his shins had blossomed into open, oozing wounds that left him unable to muster the strength to mount his cherished steed alone. Royal saddlers were summoned repeatedly to re-engineer his horse's saddle, layering ever thicker cushions beneath the leather to relieve the pressure on his ravaged flesh. And when he was not attempting the arduous task of being hoisted into the stirrups, Henry consoled himself upon a large, wheeled chair, draped in crimson velvet, such a chair outfitted with soft padding, especially fashioned to cradle his aching body. At the age of 50, the once upright Tudor monarch had become a hunchbacked, sore-legged king, perpetually reliant on an entourage of anxious attendants to support him through the echoing corridors of his palace. Despite this glaring debilitation, Henry's appetite remained voracious. He kept ornate, leather-bound notebooks, in which he meticulously noted his proposed dietary regimen, pages upon pages of solemn vows to temper his feasting. And yet, these entries served only as a testament to his unfulfilled resolutions. He flung himself upon the banquet table, as though each succulent bite and every goblet of wine might dull the searing pain below his knees. To suppress the resulting discomfort, bloating, indigestion, and nightly cramps, his physicians prescribed herbal poultices and bitters distilled from gentian and anise. But these remedies, rather than pacifying his tormented flesh, seemed only to inflame it further, tossing fresh irritants into the open ulcers and causing them to swell with renewed fury. In modern medical parlance, Henry would have embodied the classic picture of metabolic syndrome. The convergence of obesity, diabetes, and hypertension spun into a vicious cycle of worsening health. His excessive caloric intake, sedentary existence, and constricted circulation formed a triad of destructive forces, each feeding into the next and weakening his body's natural ability to repair itself. The daily banquet that once symbolized regal excess became instead an accelerator of decay, each morsel a cipher for his inexorable decline. Concurrently, the king found his renal function slipping away under the relentless burden of chronically elevated blood pressure and a salt-rich diet. By the final years of his reign, he often complained of swelling in his lower limbs, ankles ballooned like cured sausages, and his feet became pale, sodden pillows of flesh. In response, his private chamber was fitted with a specialized chair, one with a hollowed seat beneath which his legs could rest without contact, and an adjustable bed that lifted his lower half above his heart. Such contraptions, designed to drain excess fluid and stave off the agony of edema, became fixtures of his daily routine, reminders of how far removed his existence had grown from the gallant hunts and martial displays of his youth. Even as his attendants tinkered with contrivances to soothe him, records from the court paint a portrait of a king whose appearance had become macabre. What some ministers described as a tattered wax effigy, with sunken eyes circled in crimson, a gaunt jaw set in surly repose, and skin that hung in loose folds. His weight seemed to oscillate in fits. One week he would shed a few pounds, only to rebound into greater girth the next. Whenever a foreign physician or a visiting scholar dared propose a new treatment, be it acupuncture imported from the Orient or restorative soaks in mineral springs, Henry recoiled. He suspected that such novelties would betray him, revealing a capricious spirit that contradicted the unassailable image he so desperately needed to maintain. Instead, he clung tenaciously to the traditional remedies of his own court, convinced that continuity of practice was the only guarantee of his regal dignity. Yet in the heart of Whitehall, a man of such prominence ruled over a realm that could not ignore the reality of his decrepitude. Ceremonial edicts continued to flow from his penned decrees on foreign alliances, statutes on land tenure, proclamations on the governance of the Church of England, but they were authored by a monarch who could no longer stride across the dais or lean confidently over his council table. To the world, he remained the omnipotent Tudor sovereign. Behind the curtained doors, he was a prisoner of flesh, each stroke of the quill, an act of willpower to overcome the thunderous ache in his legs. This secret war he waged against his own body gave rise to a new dimension of his authority, one of inscrutable mystery and unspoken dread. The courtiers, trained to fear any hint of weakness, never broached the subject of his infirmity, lest their delicacy be deemed treachery. Instead, they spoke in measured tones about the king's steadfastness in governance, as though his rule were fueled not by heart nor bone, but by some indomitable phantom power. And so Henry's ulcers, his swelling, and his laboured breath became the most closely guarded of secrets, one that the tapestries and statues of his reign could never fully conceal, for they clung to him like a ghost, whispered of in hushed soliloquies, and carried forward in the faint echo of his strained moans. In the gentle murmur of candlelight, as nobles bowed and ambassadors presented their gifts, Henry VIII reigned supreme, yet reigned over the kingdom of his own withering body. Each royal edict he proclaimed, each alliance he forged, was underwritten by the gnawing knowledge that his flesh would not endure. And in that knowledge lay a paradox. The very crown that testified to his might also weighed him down, forging a life in which the privilege of power was inseparable from the privation of pain. Thus, as his dominion stretched across continents, the true measure of his empire became not in treaties or conquests, but in the silent testament of an ailing monarch's final years, etched indelibly in the tissues and the trembling bones that bore his crown. In the year 1547, at the age of 55, Henry VIII's reign came to its final, dolorous close. Chronic kidney failure, an insidious consequence of unrelenting high blood pressure, unbridled diabetes, and the ceaseless deterioration of his ulcerated legs, quietly claimed the once formidable sovereign. In his final days, the chronicles whisper, he lay in a state of near-constant stupor. His appetite vanished, and even the simplest rise of the chest took on the weight of a laborious task. In moments of fleeting lucidity, he summoned the scribe to his bedside and issued his last testament, bequeathing the crown to his son, Edward VI, a boy of merely 12 summers, newly acquainted with the vast responsibilities of monarchy. The funeral was held within the hallowed walls of Westminster Abbey, yet its solemn procession was devoid of the lavish fanfare that had heralded the coronations of his youth. A pall of winter's chill hung low in the air as Londoners lined the thoroughfares, standing shoulder to shoulder in silent tribute. Some bowed their heads in reverence, others trembled with a rueful nostalgia, for they had come to know him as the King of Sore Legs, a man whose afflictions had accompanied him and their memories for nearly 2 decades. Soft voices murmured of the ulcers that had never healed, of the moans that had echoed down palace corridors, and of the transformation from a swashbuckling prince to a monarch ensnared by his own fragile flesh. It is said that when his body was finally prepared for interment, the embalmers dressed him in the last suit of armour he had worn. Brass and steel wrought into the shape of his broad shoulders and portly waist, the armour bore the silent testimony of his final form. A waist measuring 52 inches around, and calves once lauded as the finest in Europe now hidden behind steel greaves. As the lid was lowered upon the bier, the flicker of torchlight revealed the tarnished metal, worn not only by the passage of time, but by the weight of unspoken suffering. Henry VIII's legacy is, like the life he led, a tapestry of contradictions. On the one hand, he stands as the architect of the Church of England, boldly severing the centuries-old bonds with Vatican authority and placing the spiritual destiny of a realm firmly in his own hands. His naval reforms and patronage of exploration cemented England's status on the high seas, charting a course toward a future empire. Yet on the other hand, his ruthless purges plans that led to the beheading of wives, nobles, and commoners alike etched into the annals of history, a portrait of a despot whose will was absolute and whose mercy was all but extinguished. And still, beyond the edifices of power and the pageantry of state, it is the sombre image of the ulcerated king that lingers most poignantly. The stories of his wounds, the constant trickle of dark fluid, the persistent, acrid odour that clung to envoys and courtiers, serve as a timeless reminder of the frailty that underlies even the loftiest throne. Scholars and physicians of later centuries have pored over his medical records and personal letters, debating in hushed tones whether it was the relentless ulcers or the cascade of related ailments that ultimately delivered the fatal blow. Was it the systemic shock of unhealed fractures and toxic cauterizations, or the slow, inescapable march of chronic disease that ended his days? The question remains as softly pondered as a prayer in a deserted chapel. Yet the most enduring lesson drawn from Henry VIII's twilight years is a quiet one, that the human body, regardless of its station, remains supremely vulnerable to its own betrayals. His ironclad rule, enforced through terror and spectacle, could not shield him from the slow devastation wrought by his own lifestyle and a lack of medical understanding. The crown he wore so proudly sat atop a body racked by pain, its power inseparable from the very wounds that threatened to undo him. In the lull of history's long night, the tale of Henry VIII stands as a lullaby, a sleep-inducing, bittersweet melody of might and misery entwined. It reminds us that strength and suffering often walk hand in hand, and that no matter how bright the torch of authority may burn, it cannot banish the shadows cast by flesh in decline. So, as we close the book on his life, let the memory of the king in his final armour, with his aching legs and unquenchable spirit, soothe us into a contemplative peace, acknowledging the fragility that lies at the heart of every human story. After Henry VIII's passing, historians turned a keen eye to the curious intersection between his frail health and the ruthless political decisions of his final years. In quiet libraries and dusty archives, scholars sifted through letters penned to Thomas Howard and Thomas Cromwell and pored over court records that bore witness to a king in constant torment. Modern research suggests that the ceaseless agony of his leg ulcers, as though his flesh was being burned alive. One chronicler noted, combined with the complications of what we now call diabetes, hypertension, and extreme overindulgence, eroded his capacity to temper his emotions. Each flare of white-hot pain left him raw and unsettled, prone to outbursts of violence as a grim form of release. It was in the wake of those intensifying wounds that he ordered the executions of Anne Boleyn, Henry Courtenay, and Henry Pole, each condemnation unfolding amid mounting pressures of succession and the ever-present dread of insurrection. Medical historians have meticulously analysed the king's correspondence and the pale, looping script of advisors' notes to identify telltale signs of metabolic syndrome. They observed references to unquenchable thirst. "I drink as though a desert's fury rages within me," he wrote, and frequent, weakening trips to the privy, alongside fluctuating weight that ebbed and flowed like the tides. Taken together, these symptoms point to a systemic disruption. The very diabetes that fed off his lavish banquets, and the hypertension that pressed upon his arteries with every heavy beat of his heart. The ulcers, once deemed the simple aftermath of broken bones, were in truth nurtured by compromised circulation, starved of the oxygen and nutrients that healthy blood should carry. Even his lavish feasts, intended to buoy his spirits, only exacerbated the siege upon his veins. This somber narrative seeped into the cultural consciousness, finding expression in art, literature, and film. Showtime's historical drama series, The Tudors, captured his transformation in vivid scenes. The confident jouster reduced to a shadowy recluse, the flash of triumph replaced by furrowed brows of pain. Alison Weir's meticulous novels describe the putrid scent of his festering wounds drifting through the corridors of Whitehall, haunting courtiers long after they had closed his door. Artists, centuries later, rendered haunting portraits of a king lying supine, his knees bound in bandages while the room around him stood silent, an eerie tableau of power's vulnerability. Yet alongside these medical interpretations, an alternate view persists, that Henry's cruelty and ambition were not born of his afflictions, but were inherent to his nature. These historians point out that long before the first ulcer appeared, Henry had charted a course of absolute authority. His bold decision to sever ties with the Pope and establish the Church of England betrays an anxious hunger for control that predates any physical ailment. In this reading, the sores on his legs acted merely as a catalyst, magnifying pre-existing tendencies toward ruthlessness. The tempest of broken bones and bloodletting may have stoked the fires of his severity, but the embers of despotism had already smouldered within him. Regardless of perspective, Henry VIII has become a definitive case study in paleopathology, the study of historical figures through the lens of disease. His life underscores the profound truth that monumental political acts are not solely the products of rational calculation, but are also shaped by the frailty and turmoil of the human body. The decrees he issued, the alliances he brokered, and the lives he extinguished were all shades painted upon the canvas of a man at war with his own flesh. In the gentle hush of modern scholarship, the story of Henry's final years resonates as a lullaby of caution. It reminds us that power, no matter how absolute, sits upon a foundation of flesh that can waver and collapse. And though the roses of his reign once bloomed in grand cathedrals and on the high seas, the winter of his suffering revealed the stark reality that even kings must contend with the limits of their mortality. So as we close the pages of his saga, let us drift into contemplation of this enduring lesson, that the mightiest decisions, bred in the crucible of pain, bear the indelible marks of the bodies that bear them. The legacy of Henry VIII's reign is woven from two distinct but inextricable threads: the sweeping religious and political transformations he set in motion, and the ruthless image of a sovereign unafraid to wield the axe at his pleasure. In breaking from Rome and establishing the Church of England, he not only wrested spiritual authority from the Pope, but forever altered the course of English history. For over 4 centuries, monarchs would bear the title Supreme Head of their national church, a mantle first claimed in 1534, when Henry convened Parliament to sever ties with Vatican authority. By centralising the power to grant peerages and to bestow noble titles once the sole domain of the Roman pontiff, he shaped the very architecture of governance, ensuring that all allegiance flowed upward to his own person. Yet this era of reform was accompanied by a darker chronicle. The same pen that scripted grand acts of supremacy also signed the death warrants of wives, dukes, earls, and even loyal subjects whose only misstep was to whisper about the king's frailty. Public proclamations announcing executions never hinted at the true impetus for these grim sentences. No dispatch spoke of the ulcers that tortured his legs, or of the embarrassment and bitterness that festered within his chambers. Instead, each royal edict cited charges of treason, heresy, or incest formal accusations, designed to lend a veneer of legality to the spectacle of bloodshed. As each head fell, lipstick-coloured stains spidered across the scaffold boards. and the shadow of sorrow draped itself over the palace's once bright banners. Thus, the Tudor bloodline shone not only with regal splendor, but also with a haunting reminder of those cast aside in the pursuit of absolute authority. Over the centuries, artists and playwrights have turned to this duality with some fascination. In the glow of footlights and the flicker of cinema screens, Henry VIII emerges as the archetypal tyrant. His fateful fall in 1536, the narrowing of his armor as his girth expanded, and the lurid tales of his leg wounds have all become indispensable motifs. Stage directors often accentuate the reek of his ulcers, directing actors to tug at their sleeves in revulsion as the king shuffles forward. Cinematic retellings linger on the leather bandages, wrapped tightly around his calves, juxtaposing images of a battered body with the gleam of crown and scepter. In these works, the physical deformity is never incidental. It stands as a poignant symbol of power's vulnerability, a jarring counterpoint to the gold-embroidered robes and majestic rhetoric. The eminent historian Eric William Ives once observed, "Henry VIII is not merely a figure in history, he is a tragedy that reveals the frailty of both flesh and authority." Such reflections underscore the necessity of viewing his reign not only through the lens of diplomatic maneuvering and doctrinal upheaval, but also through the twin prisms of medical suffering and psychological strain. To discuss his foreign alliances, his naval expansions, or his architectural patronage, without acknowledging the constant spectre of pain that haunted every council meeting would be, in a sense, to regard only half a portrait. We must also acknowledge the inner turmoil, the restless nights, and the days blurred by the haze of torment that informed the pen he used to decree both church reform and capital punishment. From a deeply humanistic standpoint, the story of Henry VIII serves as a cautionary tale about the perils of concealing illness in a society that exalts unyielding strength. When the sovereign of a realm is beset by suffering but forbidden any display of vulnerability, the response often takes the form of cruelty and terror. In refusing to allow his subjects to glimpse his pain, Henry cultivated a culture of fear, one in which compassion was shunned, and the slightest hint of sympathy for the king's condition was tantamount to betrayal. The wider lesson, echoed in later monarchies and even in modern autocracies, is that governance based on the gaze of intimidation rather than on common humanity sows seeds of brutality that can bloom for generations. It is an irony of history that the very measures Henry took to secure his power, establishing a national church, consolidating peerages, and suppressing dissent, also sealed his legacy as a ruler forever associated with dread. His reforms endure, inscribed in the statutes and the liturgy of the Anglican tradition. Yet alongside these proud achievements remains the indelible impression of a king who, in his final decades, could look upon his kingdom only through the murky lens of pain and suspicion. The echoes of his spasmodic outbursts, his blade's cold descent upon the guilty and the innocent alike, still reverberate in the corridors of power. As we recline in the gentle embrace of memory, lulled by the softness of a history long settled, Henry VIII emerges not as a mere footnote, but as a somnolent sentinel. His life reminds us that behind every decree and every reform lies the fragile vessel of the human form, subject to the vicissitudes of illness and the whisperings of the mind. And so, as we close our eyes and drift into reflection, let our last thought be one of compassion, that in the grandeur of empires and the grandeur of faith, it is the quiet suffering of the body and soul that shapes even the mightiest of legacies. As we draw this somnolent journey through the life and legacy of Henry VIII to a close, you may find yourself reflecting on far more than broken bones and royal intrigue. Today's video has offered a window into the hidden dimensions of power, how bodily suffering can shape the mind, influence the course of empires, and leave an imprint on history that endures long after a monarch's crown has been laid to rest. By witnessing Henry's relentless struggle with ulcerated legs, unchecked indulgence, and chronic illness, we gain a deeper appreciation for the complex interplay between physical health and psychological resilience. First and foremost, this tale reminds us of the vital importance of acknowledging and caring for our own well-being. In the modern world, where stress and overwork can easily lead us to neglect our bodies, Henry's story serves as a gentle warning. When we push ourselves beyond healthy limits, we risk not only our physical strength but also our emotional balance. Today's scholarship on holistic health underscores exactly this point. It is only by honoring our vulnerabilities that we can maintain the clarity and compassion necessary to guide our decisions, whether in leadership roles or in the quiet routines of daily life. Another enduring message lies in the power of empathy. Throughout the 16th century, Henry's courtiers were bound by protocol and fear, unable to express genuine concern for his condition. In contrast, our era cherishes open dialogue about mental and physical health. By sharing our challenges, be they chronic pain, illness, or emotional strain, we invite understanding and support rather than isolation and suspicion. When we learn to listen with kindness, we not only strengthen our relationships but also prevent the very despair that drove Henry to lash out in anger and defensiveness. Moreover, the video highlights how the choices of one individual can reverberate across generations. Henry's decision to conceal his suffering and to wield power through intimidation reshaped religious institutions, political structures, and cultural memory. In our lifetime, each of us exercises influence over our families, our workplaces, and our communities. Recognizing the weight of that influence encourages us to lead with integrity, to seek solutions that honor both our ambitions and our shared humanity. For those of us who seek practical takeaways, consider adopting one small change today. Pause before your next grand undertaking and ask yourself, am I truly well enough physically, mentally, and emotionally to give this my best? Then grant yourself permission to rest, to seek help, or to adjust your pace. In this way, Henry's cautionary example becomes not an outdated relic, but a guiding star illuminating the path to sustainable strength. As this video draws to a close, take with you the quiet power of self-awareness, the enduring value of empathy, and the knowledge that true authority springs not from fear, but from the courage to face our own limitations. May these reflections accompany you into peaceful rest, whether that means settling in with a good book, sharing a gentle smile with a loved one, or simply closing your eyes to drift off. And so, dear viewer, if you are still awake, we wish you a very good night. May your dreams be light and your morning bright. If you enjoyed this journey into history's whispered secrets, please subscribe to our channel and tap the bell icon so you won't miss our newest and most fascinating videos. Sleep well, and we'll see you in the next story.